had a number of guests join us at 10:30 because today was a day where we invited people to come and be a part of our local learning. I want to welcome all of you who are here. I also know that people are watching on live stream, and so I want to bring a greeting to all of you who are watching on video across the Synod and the country. We're grateful that you can join us and be a part of our day as we learn about global mission and also think about our local mission. So I'd like to invite forward our guest teacher, Pastor Sunitha Mortha, and have her come forward and teach us about the concept of accompaniment. Yes, let's give her a warm hand.
So much. Can you hear me? Yes. If you can put your hands together and repeat after me, please. Namaste. 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 It's an honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And my name is Sunitha Mortha, and I have the privilege of working at the ELCA Global Mission Office. I direct the education program there, and Globals are part of that programming. It touches my heart to see the expressions of the church come together and strengthen one another in this conversation. So wherever we go, as part of the global programming, we're bringing the songs and stories and the witness of what is happening locally and also globally. And we're asking some important questions around mission. So today, I'll be asking some questions to you and with you, and we hope that it'll generate some good conversation. Is my PowerPoint, there we go, presentation. Mission associations. So for a single second, I am going to ask you, when I say mission, what comes to your mind? Just think about an image. When I say mission, think about an image. I'll come back to this image because all of us, whether through the stories of our foremothers and forefathers, or through our church congregations, or through the faith communities that have brought us up, have a story about mission. I have a story about mission. You have a story about mission. And so when we close our eyes for just a second when we say mission, that story comes together in an image. But there's some interesting things that are happening in our context. Our executive director, Reverend Rafael Malpica, says that it feels like the world is descending on us nowadays. And when you see someone that's standing in front of you, you can see me, and I can be from India, which actually I am from. I can be from Guyana, or I can be from Chicago. That's where I live and work, actually. So the world is coming together in a different and fascinating ways. And so today, I'd like to talk about a couple of questions. No matter which era you're part of or which generation you're part of, there's some fundamental questions that are part of understanding what's happening in mission. Here are a couple of questions for us today. Whose mission? Why mission? Where in the world? With and among whom? How? And what for? Now, these seems like some fundamental questions that you would actually ask about anything. But when we ask these questions in the context that we're living today, there's some interesting responses that we're listening to. So let's take a look at what they might be. I don't know about all of you, but I often think that I'm the center of the universe. And so usually when I think about mission, it's my mission. I think about my mission, or the mission of my congregation, or the mission of my synod, or the mission of my companion church, or the mission of the church-wide office. And a lot of times, I think we need to remind one another that it's God's mission that we get to participate in. Oftentimes in mission conversations, we have to remind one another that we don't take God somewhere else, right? God is already there, you know? Sometimes we do in mission think that Jesus is in our pocket and then we can go distribute Jesus, right? And so this is a good way to remember that God is out there bringing life, bringing hope, bringing Ruha, the breath of God, in the world. And we get to participate in this mission. It's God's work, our hands. So whose mission is it? It's God's mission and our hands. Where in the world do we do mission? And here are some of the interesting things that are happening in our context. If I asked you, where do you think there are more than 5 million Lutherans in the world? Germany, these are the usual suspects. The United States, this is all the Lutheran church bodies that are in the United States, it's 7 million. And then there is Sweden. And these numbers are interesting because this is church and state combined, right? This is not worshiping. And then so now comes the interesting aspects. Did you know that there are 5 million Lutherans in Indonesia? Huh. Which church is the largest Lutheran church in the world? Tanzania. Very close. Any other guesses? There's Tanzania with 5 million. And currently, Ethiopia is the largest Lutheran church in the world. Isn't that amazing? This is what's happening around the world. The church is busting at the seams in the southern hemisphere of the world. And a lot of times we don't know this in our congregations or in our conversations in the ELCA. The church is busting at the seams in the southern hemisphere. So there are interesting things that are happening in conversation around theology, mission, and ministry as the center of Christendom is moving to Africa. Has already moved, I guess. And so there's another reality, right? Global. I know this word annoys some people, but we coined this word to bring our attention to these intersections that are happening between local and global mission. That line we have drawn between local and global has already disappeared. The church is actually catching up to it. In about 20, 30 years, our own backyards, I think I heard that 1 in 5 people will be non-Latino white person as a Christian. And so things are shifting. We know this. We see the numbers. Our backyards are changing. Our grocery stores are changing. Our schools are changing. So what is local and what is global is actually very hard to define nowadays. And so a lot of us are living in global realities that are both local and global simultaneously. And so this word for us brings our attention to these powerful intersections that are happening. So where in mission, and I don't know a lot about the image that came to your mind when I said what is mission, maybe the image was associated more towards global mission. Or maybe it was associated with local mission. But usually in our tradition, mission was associated somewhere over there. But mission is strongly coming in front of us as both local and global. Let's hear. So Shrek, our friend Shrek, is trying to explain to the donkey about ogres. Ogres have layers. They're like onions. And I think in our church too, we forget that we're like onions, that we do have layers. And so, did you know that you're a part of 10,000 congregations? If you're a part of a congregation, Lutheran congregation, you're part of 10,000 congregations that are part of the ELCA. You're also part of 65 synods. You're also, another layer that you have is that you're part of a church-wide organization that I have the privilege of working in, where there's domestic mission and there's a global mission unit and there's a mission advancement unit. And we have so many other partners that are part of these expressions of the church, companion synods, outdoor ministries, campuses, women of the ELCA, Lutheran Men in Mission, our magazines, and also there are layers that I heard about the plunge. The plunge, takes us to the outer layer of our expression is the Lutheran World Federation is 70 million Lutherans come together through that body. And what we cannot do by ourselves, we do together. And so yes, you have something very similar to Shrek. You have something common with Shrek, that you are an onion as well and you have layers. And this is how we live our faith out as the body of Christ. So in this context, when things are shifting so much and there's so many trends happening in global mission, the ELCA has interpreted the way that they engage in mission as accompaniment. You've heard the word used here and in different testimonies that you've heard from the podium. This accompaniment is how we're seeing mission, how we're understanding mission, how we're doing mission. And so it's really about walking together that practices interdependence and solidarity with our companions and with those that we serve. In this walk, we exchange gifts, resources, advice, and admonition. And so we have been immersed in this text in the past day, Luke 24 chapter, where we talked about the disciples walking on the road of Emmaus. This was right after Christ's crucifixion, and they were saying, what just happened? And Christ joins the disciples and said, what are the things that are happening? And they wrestle with scripture, and they go and break bread together, and Christ is recognized, and their hearts were set on fire as they returned back to Jerusalem. And this is a wonderful scripture to think about as we think about mission. When we talk about accompaniment, we're talking about these 5 values that have popped up. And these values have popped up because of the people practicing them, missionaries, companion synod folks, people that on the ground that have walked with people, say that these are some 5 values that keep popping up about mission. One is mutuality. Is our mission mutual? Is there mutual respect? Is there a level playing field? Do we expect to receive the same amount as we give? Is our mission mutual? Mutuality is a big word, and it translates into so many different ways that we engage. And so one way to think about whether we are accompanying somebody is to ask whether it is a mutual relationship. This document on accompaniment is in your flash drives or in your binders, just that you have this document with you. And inclusivity. Are our mission efforts asking the question, when we're sitting around tables, is everybody around the table? Who's missing around the table? Especially when we are making decisions or making decisions about access to resources. Are people around the table? Are our partners around the table? Are people that we're serving around the table? And not all values pop up at the same time. When you're trying to be mutual, sometimes you can't be inclusive. When you're trying to be inclusive, sometimes you cannot be mutual. Vulnerability. I know vulnerability is sort of not such a good word in this culture. That's what I've learned. Because it somehow feels like it is a weakness to say that you are vulnerable. But when we look at mission in the past and when we look to how we're engaging in mission now, mission often appears with power. And I think we're being invited to understand mission as stepping forward in our vulnerability, to share that identity that we know that we are a broken people and that we in Christ find our freedom in that brokenness. And to be able to engage in mission with that kind of vulnerability. That would be a space for people to be vulnerable and to understand and associate this word with mission more than power. It's a radical shift. The last one, before the last one, the empowerment is another word, a value of accompaniment. Are people being empowered in the relationship? Are we empowered to proclaim and serve? Is our companions or the people that we serve being empowered in the relationship? Or are we creating dependencies? Is an important, and Bishop John had mentioned this in his sermon. And is mission sustainable? I think sometimes we're very attracted to mission that's a Band-Aid that can fix it, but mission is really about relationships, relationships, and relationships. So is mission about committing to these relationships for the long haul? So I hope this gives you an idea of the concept of accompaniment. And here is something that I found on your website that really talks about why we engage in mission. As members of the ELCA, we believe we are freed in Christ to serve and love our neighbor. With our hands, we do God's work of restoring and reconciling communities in Jesus Christ and throughout the world. And another shift that we're seeing as we talk about mission in our context, we're talking about mission being God's reconciling and restoring work. Now that is something new as well. I don't know, when I was growing up, I didn't hear mission being talked about in this way. That it was God's reconciling us to God's self, and God reconciling us with one another, and God reconciling us with creation. And to understand mission in that way has been powerful to me. So for what? For the question of what? To participate in God's reconciling mission. I feel like there's a delay in, okay. So that's sort of a frame that I wanted to give you as we're talking about accompaniment. And so when we talk about accompaniment, there are some implications to what we're saying. Just like there's no new questions under the sky, why mission, what mission, where, when, there are three stories that always pop up when we're talking about mission. Do you have an idea of what these stories might be? There's three stories that pop up when we talk about mission. Come on, folks, I need some back and forth. Just like Pastor David, I know the Minnesotan veil has come down, but come on. Okay, so what are some of the stories? I can't hear you. Yeah, Philip from Ethiopia, she's talking about the Bible story from the Bible. And so in a really broad way, there are three stories that always pop up. And if you can understand this, you might as well have gotten a PhD or a degree in missiology. This is God's story, my story, your story, and the story of creation. So no matter, which book you open, it really is about God's story, my story, and your story. Mission is about God's story, my story, and your story. But when we look at mission, this is something that usually happens. There is a line between my story and your story. By the way, usually God's on my side of the story, if you haven't noticed. Right? There's a line between my story and your story. What do you think that could be? What are some of the ways that we draw lines between our stories, you and another person? What's that? Age. Language. Race. Thank you. Economics, big one. Culture. Excellent. You're warming up. Someone said power? Very good. Race? Faith. Very nice. So you see, it's right under the surface. We all know the things that we draw, the lines that we draw between my story and your story or someone else's story. And it can be, people that you don't know at all, or it can be people that in your neighborhood, or it could be the political other, right? Yeah, we draw a line between the political other and ourselves. And we know how we draw these lines. And interestingly enough, mission is the defining question in mission that's before us, actually, is how do we engage the other? We know that the other exists, right? We know that the other exists. We can feel it. The world is descending on us. But then how do we engage the other? So in the next half of my session here, I would like to talk to you about how practically then we understand accompaniment landing. And I am going to pick on the other that is culturally different from us. And I deliberately do this because I think culture gives us some nice entry points to have a conversation. I think things get a little more heated when we're talking about race or gender or those kinds of things. But culture, in my experience, has been a way that we can ease into these conversations. I don't know. We'll see what you think. So culturally, who is the other? There's many definitions that are out there on culture. If you Google the educational institution of our times, and you'll find all these definitions, right? Are shared, learned, symbolic systems of values, beliefs, attitudes that shape and influence our perception, a mental blueprint or a mental code. But when I think about culture, I just imagined a group of people that came together. They looked at the sky, they looked at the land, they looked at one another, and they asked, what does this mean? And boom, culture was born. I'm here with the Sound and Light Show, folks. God is on my side. Yes. Now the room is warming up. Thank you. Yeah, and boom, culture was born. As we're asking these questions, how do we relate to one another? How do we get married? How do we eat? How do we live? And then culture is born. Culture is interesting, like the glasses that we wear. They're glasses that we wear. They sit on the tip of our nose. They're invisible. But when we look through these glasses, it shapes things that we see. It gives color to the things that we see. It brightens the things that we see. It gives meaning and value to the things that we see. And then it also creates blind spots. The tricky thing about these glasses is that you cannot take them off. You cannot take those glasses off. And when you have the privilege of living in another society or another culture, sometimes you get a glimpse of how things look like through some other people's lenses. So these are some great images to think about culture. And I put something up there which is a motherboard, right? If you open up a computer, and what do you see in there? You see a motherboard. Is this stereotypical that an Indian is telling you about computers? Actually, I was a computer programmer in my previous vocation. And so when you open up that computer and you see that motherboard there, you know, it has all these wires in the motherboard. And you know what these wires do? They tell the computer what it should do when you press a button. So culture is like your wiring. It's that deep. And why is culture then important? It is important because it acts as a filter, you know, and I think about, Gwen, just what you were talking about in your report. You know, we were talking about it creates great clarity, but it also gives you blind spots. It acts as a filter, and it has huge influence on you because it shapes your values. And because of the values that it shapes, then it has impact because it dictates how you engage other people or creation or different kinds of relationships in your life. So it's a filter and has influence and it has impact. So here are some characteristics about culture. Now there's a lot of conversation about whether culture is nature or nurture, you know, and I think it's a little bit of both. I always say that if there was an Indian baby that's born this morning, and I'm telling you there are a lot of Indian babies that are being born this morning, we're 1 billion and growing, so I would say that the Indian baby would have a little leaning towards spicy food. What do you say? Right? Sometimes culture is in our blood, but it's also learned. Right? It's learned. And so when I was little, I would reach out with my hand to take the ball of rice with my left hand, and my mom would say, "No, Chinna, that's not what we do. We eat with our right hand." And so my mom ate like that, my dad ate like that, my uncle ate like that, and I learned it because it was modeled and patterned. They would say, "We dress like this, we relate like this, we get married like this." So it was something that I learned. And it's not a culture of one. Usually you might have a preference because there's plenty of Indians that don't like really spicy food. But usually it's a culture that is agreed upon by a group. So as a group here, and I will tell you, we've been to about 9 Synod assemblies now, and each Synod assembly has its own culture. It has its own culture. And when we enter here, we don't really know what we might get applauded for, yay, or what we might get booed for. We don't know, because we don't know the culture of the Synod. And so it's not just a culture that's somewhere over there. You have a culture in your home, you have a culture in your neighborhood, you have a culture in your region. We were in Texas, and let me tell you, they have a culture. So it is something that is shared by a community. It is something agreed upon in a community. And I always think that in the United States, when I stand up here wearing my Indian garb, and I talk very articulately, and I appear to be a very confident and an independent woman, I can feel the American people just cheering for me. Yay, Sunitha, go for it. But I wonder if I wear this and I cover my head and I talk about submission to God and obedience and duty, whether I'll hear some boos. And so then, it's patterned, it's modeled, it's repeated over and over and over again till it becomes ingrained and wired in like the motherboard. Culture is like that. until it seems normal. It's just wired in you because you've just done it all your life. And culture pops up as symbols. Culture and its values pop up as symbols. And if you don't believe me, you should look at cars passing by, and then, if they have bumper stickers on the cars, you can tell a little bit about where their values are, right? Right? And you're either like rolling your eyes and saying, or, honking, saying you agree. So you see how they appear in symbols. And so, symbol, like, you can take a look at that, and that could be a cloth with a bunch of colors in it. But, if you do something to that flag, the emotions that rise up. What you value surfaces up as those symbols, as that flag. And so, if you still want to know what your culture values or someone other culture values, you should watch commercials. They're a good way that symbols are represented. So then culture also is internalized. So why would we talk about culture when we're talking about mission? Because a lot of times as we're understanding mission, it's frozen again. Okay, there we go. So in my conversations, in our trainings and events, mission is often understood as a transfer of cultural and national values when we're thinking about mission. I want you to hold that. Usually when I talk to people, people think that Christian mission is about just transferring one cultural values to another place or some national values to another place. So let's talk about that a little bit. This is why it is so crucial for us to have this conversation around culture. Here's another teaching tool. As you think about taking these conversations that you're hearing here to your context and to your community, these are great teaching tools. Culture is like an iceberg. And so if I say culture is like an iceberg, what would be at the tip of the iceberg? What do you see when you see me here? Clothing, hair, skin color. Come on, folks, just say it. Cute shoes. I like that. So you see, there are different things. You're absolutely right. And I would encourage you, one of the things that I often hear around race conversations in the ELCA and even in the wider society, that people say that they don't see color, and no, I think, we have to recognize we do see color. We do see color. So it's at the tip of the iceberg, right? Games, cooking, dress, fine arts, they're at the tip of the iceberg. If that's at the tip of the iceberg, what is underneath the water? Come on. Prejudice, values, beliefs. Excellent. You already know this. The theory of disease, relationship to animals, cosmology, rules of descent, notions of modesty, notions of leadership, arrangement of physical space, definition of sin, concept of status, mobility, courtship practices. Ooh, it's complicated, isn't it? So the way that I've made sense of this is what's at the tip, what's underneath the water gives meaning to the things that are at the tip of the iceberg. What's underneath the water gives value to the things that are at the tip of the iceberg. What's underneath the water gives value and meaning to the things that are above the water. I'll give you examples. Okay? So let's take notions of modesty. As I shared, I lived in India pretty much all my life. And my father used to teach at the seminary, and we'd have a lot of groups from the United States come to the seminary. And I could tell that the women, that you all had your training here, and they told you to wear long skirts because to be sensitive to the culture, and they would wear the long skirts and they would come to visit. And then we knew that they weren't used to wearing long skirts because they would pick up their skirts and start fanning themselves because it was so hot. And so there was something very interesting that I saw when that was happening. When they would lift their skirt up a little bit and fan themselves, I would see a reaction from the community that I was living with. They'd be like, what is that? She's showing our leg. So I would see that reaction from our community. And so when I came to the United States and I had the privilege of working with youth and young adults, I had thought that you all had no notions of modesty when I came to the United States. Because, I thought, well, you can wear bikinis, what will be the notions of modesty here in the United States? And so when I came here, I was wrong, actually. You know how I found out? When I was working with youth and young adults, especially with young ladies, in the code, besides cleavage, they asked them to cover another part of their body. Do you know what part of their body it was? The midriff. They asked young women not to wear short shirts. And you know what? This was very surprising to me, because has any one of you seen an Indian woman wear a sari? It's a little different from this dress. It's 7 yards of fabric that Indian women wrap around their bodies, but their belly shows. Everything else is covered, but their belly shows. And I was so tickled, actually, because it's the same belly, but what it means is completely different. The notion of modesty that's associated with a body part was completely different. So that's how it works. What's on the tip of the iceberg, the value and the meaning of what it means is under the water. Isn't that crazy? Then you must be sitting here thinking, what is this woman going on talking about bellies and mission? What does this have to do with mission? Well, I want to give you a funny story. A couple of years ago, I think now it has to be 6 or 7 years ago, there was a synod that went to visit their companions in an indigenous area in Africa. And when these companions, the synod went there, they noticed that the women didn't wear anything on the top. The men didn't either. And so they decided to do a project. What do you think the project was? Come on, say it. It was a bra project. And so the synod decided to then send a couple of bras to their companions. And after 6 months, they went to see how things were going. After 6 months, they went there, and then they found out that they were using them. But the men were using them. The men had them tied around their waist, and they were using the cups as cup holders. I guess God works in spite and despite us. How am I doing on time? About 10 minutes? Okay. I have 10 minutes. So I just want to share with you that I will continue. I have a couple of times that I will be in front of you. So I'll continue this conversation in the sessions that I have. But one of the things I want to leave with you here is that, now that is funny to us. Look at us, how we laugh out loud, when we hear episodes like this. And it seems silly, right? It seems like that was just almost an exaggerated example. But we do this all the time with one another. We look at the tip of the iceberg and we decide what other people need with the lens that we're wearing. And it happens so often in mission because it's really hard to be in relationship, to have that value of sustainability in there. It takes a lot of effort to be in relationship, to find out what's happening under the water, to allow people to articulate what it is that they need and they want and they find meaning in. We do this all the time in mission. So something to think about. And also, another thing is that, yes, this is easy enough for me to say and you to agree and we can laugh about. But when we travel a little deeper into the water, I talk about courtship practices. And I'm going to say that really fast and then pick it up again in my next session. Did you know that 98% of Indians, whether they're rural, whether they're urban, whether they're educated, whether they're illiterate, or that we practice arranged marriages? Did you know this? Some of you might, because there are a couple of Indians in Minnesota, aren't there? Yes. And so, when I say arranged marriages, and usually I open up the space to have a conversation, because, you know, I said I thought you all didn't have any notions of modesty. I usually say that you can say whatever you want to say to me about arranged marriages. And usually people will tell me, you know, where's the choice with arranged marriages? You know, where's the love in arranged marriages? It's like older women, older men, oh, that would be a reality, right? Older women getting married to young men. Yeah, older men getting married to young women. Women treated like property. These are the things that people have said to me. Uncivilized, barbaric. When people are really honest with me, they would say these things about arranged marriages. And so now when we talk about arranged marriages, we're really getting into the under the water, right? We're really getting under the water. This is where our icebergs start rubbing, because we're doing life in a different way. And so how do arranged marriages work? Arranged marriages work when, you know, families come together. You know, families come together, and these are a couple of things that these families look for. The same faith background, the same economic status usually, and sometimes it's okay if the guy has a different economic status. How are they doing financially? Do the families get along? Not so much the individuals. Do the families get along? And are they from the same caste system? We have an oppressive system in India that's called the caste system. And so even in that, you have to check whether you're from the same caste. And then usually the pastor, if it's a Christian community in India, the pastors are the mediators as arranged marriages happen. And chemistry is the last and least part of this, sometimes. And sometimes these arranged marriages happen instantly, like, you know, families come together, they decide, and in 10 days, the marriages are fixed. Otherwise, if it's in more urban areas, there'd be some dating or allowing people to go for dinner or that sort of a thing. And this is how arranged marriages happen. Why would 1 billion people do this? And as I was, you know, because I grew up in India, but I also had the opportunity to travel the United States a lot, I asked my dad, you know, but what about love, Daddy? When you think about arranged marriages. Then he asked me one question. He said, so I said, what about love? What about choice? And he asked me, did you have a choice into which family you were born into? And then, so he said, do you love your family? And I was like, Then he said, what kind of love is that, Chinna? So he said, it's a love that is about a shared life. It's a love that's talking about a journey that you're going to have together. In a family, the bond is created because you live life together. You go through your ups and your downs together, and that's the kind of love that's formed. And when we mean love, when that love surfaces up to the tip of the iceberg, and when someone in the United States says love, it's completely different. And you know another big reason why arranged marriage happens in India and not in the United States? There's one big difference between my onion and your onion. There's one big difference between my iceberg and your iceberg. Do you know what that one difference is? If you peel your onion, you will find the eye at the center of your onion. If you peel my onion or dig into my iceberg, you will find family at the center. 2/3 of the world is collectivist at its center. 2/3 of the world. And therefore, what you value, which is individualism, surfaces up dating as a practice. And for the Indian culture, which is actually trying to protect community over the individual, surfaces up arranged marriage. So I leave that with you and come back to this conversation afterwards. Thank you.